Defiant in the face of increasing isolation, Iraqi Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki resists pressure at home and abroad to step down. But with support growing for his replacement, can he hang on to his job? And calm widespread discontent over his divisive rule. This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Martine Dennis. Now, it's a measure of how badly the regional and international community wants to see the back of the Iraqi Prime Minister, Nouri al-Maliki. Opposition to his divisive rule has brought together long-time adversaries, Iran and Saudi Arabia, while the US and the EU, the Arab League and Turkey, they're all backing the man who's been chosen to replace him, Iraq's Deputy Speaker, Haider al-Abadi. Now, Maliki has been unable to form a new government since winning April elections, and now, at a time of deep national crisis, with fighters from the Islamic State group taking over large swathes of the country, patience with Maliki is really running out. We'll get to our discussion in just a minute, after we've heard from Al Jazeera's Zaina Khoda, who's in Erbil in northern Iraq.
Iraq's parliament has nominated a new prime minister, Haider al-Abadi, and he really got a lot of support from the international community, as well as a number of Iraqi political parties, including Shia factions. They've thrown their weight behind him. Iran, a close ally of the Iraqi government and a country really which holds a lot of influence here. So Haider al-Abadi enjoying all this support, but Nouri al-Maliki refusing to give up. He is justifying the fact that he's remaining in power, saying that he's protecting the constitution, he's protecting democracy in Iraq. He's saying that the electorate voted for his party. His party did secure the most number of seats, but not the outright majority that is needed. Now, forming a government is going to be a very challenging task for Abadi. He's going to have to make sure that all of Iraq's groups feel represented, not only represented, but they need to have a say, because this whole crisis is from the very fact that a certain segment of the Iraqi population, the Sunnis, felt left out. They felt marginalized. They felt alienated and targeted by the Maliki government. You're going to need them on board if Iraq as a country is going to take on the Islamic State group, which is becoming a growing concern, a growing threat in Iraq. So far, we haven't heard from the Sunni armed groups on the ground who are fighting alongside the Islamic State, not necessarily because they support their ideology, but they see them as an ally in their fight against a common enemy, the Baghdad government. But what we understand from some Sunni tribal elders is that we will not end our fight until the end of Iran's influence in Iraq. This is going to be a very difficult process. So forming the government is just the first step. There is a war. The government has lost control of the Sunni heartland. Taking it back will not be easy, especially since much of the Iraqi army has collapsed. And here in Erbil, Kurds are worried that the Islamic State group has their eyes on the capital here in the north, and the US airstrikes have managed to push them back, but the threat is not over.
All right, let's introduce our guests for this edition of Inside Story. In our London studios, we have Shiraz Maher, Senior Research Fellow at King's College London. Joining us from Baghdad is Mark Kimmitt, a former US State Department official and retired Brigadier General. Also in London, we have Mina Al Oraibi, Assistant Editor-in-Chief of the Asharq Al Awsat newspaper, who's interviewed the Iraqi Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki on several occasions. So can I start with you then, Mina? This is a moment in Iraq's political life that's been described as critical, as seminal. How do you see it?
It is absolutely critical, especially since Nouri al-Maliki was prime minister for 8 years. It is seminal also, of course, because of the presence of ISIS, or the Islamic State for Iraq and Syria, as it was formerly called, in Mosul, the second city of Iraq, and making gains in other parts of the country. However, it is also a chance to rise above the broken political system that has been in Iraq for over a decade. While Nouri al-Maliki holds a lot of the blame of what happened, he had political partners and political parties within his government that acquiesced, or at least accepted, the way that the political system treated different segments of Iraqi society.
Can I move on now to Mark Kimmitt, who's actually in the Iraqi capital, Baghdad, and ask you then how this particular moment looks to you, being there right at the seat of the Iraqi government. How does it appear to you?
Well, doing a governmental transition is difficult in any period of time, especially in a place such as Iraq. But with the backdrop of a significant military operation going on against Daesh, you're really having a transition under a significant amount of violence. Nonetheless, here inside of Baghdad, while there's a certain amount of tension among the parties and among the people, there is a sense of potential optimism that there may be a turning of the chapter in the incoming weeks, and I think everybody hopes that there will be government formation in the near term.
Shiraz Maher in London. So Mark Kimmitt has pointed up a certain degree of optimism then at this particular chapter in Iraqi political history. How do you see it? Do you see this as a moment for optimism, or perhaps one which presages a complete political meltdown?
Well, I think there are grounds for cautious optimism insofar as there seems to be support right now for this, for changing, removing Maliki and changing the Prime Minister. That seems to be a potential opportunity here to bring in different elements of Iraqi society. Regional actors such as Saudi Arabia and Iran seem to be backing this as well. And of course, more broadly internationally, there seems to be support for this. But I think it should be noted that Maliki's own supporters are attempting to resist this. They've said they will seek a judicial review, they will fight this attempt through the courts. And so it's not clear to me just yet that we are about to see a transition. There's momentum for it, but there could be roadblocks too.
Thank you for that, for your introductory remarks. Now, let's take this opportunity to have a look at the man who's been selected or who's been thrown up to take the place of the much beleaguered Mr. Maliki. He is one of Iraq's most senior politicians. His name is Haider al-Abadi, and he returned to Iraq from exile in 2003 and has been in contention for the Prime Minister's job on two previous occasions, in 2006 and in 2010. He's also a member of Maliki's Shia Dawa party, but is seen by allies as more moderate and less divisive. And, just as a note of interest, his favourite quote, according to his Facebook biography, is, "The key to leadership is tolerance." And Mina, can I put that back to you now? So if Mr. Abadi thinks that the key to successful leadership is tolerance, is that what we can expect from him? Because he has a mammoth task ahead of him.
He has a huge task ahead of him. However, it's not necessarily his tolerance, rather than the pressures he's going to be facing, not only domestically, but also internationally, at bringing people together rather than dividing them. He was very close to Prime Minister Maliki previously. He's also close to Ibrahim al-Jafari, who was the Prime Minister prior to Maliki. And so he is not someone who is been against the way that Iraq has been governed in the last few years. We have to keep that into account. However, he does have good relations with most of the political players in Baghdad, which will allow him to actually make a difference. I think the big difference will be the fact that you have the Iranians, Saudi Arabia, the US, Turkey, and others all saying we have to move behind this man to stop the divisive politics. But his character as such, he's quite eloquent. He is quite methodical in how he works. I guess his scientific background, so to speak, helps him as an engineer. And he has tried in previous times when he's inside of Iraq or even travels abroad to reach out to different Iraqis.
And Mark, can I put that to you then? Because Mina's suggesting that Mr. Abadi is not exactly a fresh broom, if you like. I mean, he's come from exactly the same poison chalice, if you like, of the crucible of Iraqi politics, which has been overseen by Mr. Maliki for 8 years and clearly has not worked for the country. So can we expect terribly much from him?
Well, I think there's going to be some first 100 days types of problems that he's going to be dealing with. And he's got a very, very difficult task ahead of him. There is an imbalance in the power sharing arrangements and the resource sharing arrangements inside of Iraq, and there have been for quite a few years. Whether he is able to rebalance those resource and those power differentials inside the country to bring the Sunnis back in, but not to the point where the Shia feel that they are being threatened by their old masters. It's not an issue of giving more to the Sunnis at the expense of the Shia and at the expense of the Kurds. It's about making everybody understand that it's one Iraq, that everybody can share in it, that the issue is not about how the pie is sliced, but how you actually make the pie grow and get beyond this tension that we've seen for years and years.
Shiraz, now, as Mina mentioned a little bit earlier, he does now, Mr. Abadi does now seem to have the support of the broader regional and wider international community, which obviously is welcome for him. But that was, of course, the case, wasn't it, 8 years ago for Mr. Maliki, the Americans being the biggest supporters of him, despite, we are now told, warnings coming from several directions that this was not necessarily somebody who was up to the job, the immense task then of uniting a very fractured country.
And I think that's the key challenge here right now. We can set aside all the international support for Mr. Abadi at this moment in time. What really matters, what his immediate priority has to be, and the challenge that will be dominating any government if he's successful in putting it together, is how do you begin to build a civic nationalism, a civic identity in a country like Iraq that has been riddled for so long now with sectarian divisiveness. And unfortunately, in the years that have been here, sort of post-Saddam and since the removal of his regime, we've not seen any concrete steps from any of the political leadership to do that. And I think when we begin to understand Iraq through that prism, you can see why certain parts of the country have fallen away so quickly to the ISIS incursion. It's because local populations are not buying into any kind of central, overarching, unifying idea about the notion of what Iraq is supposed to mean to them. And so you're seeing this sort of slow disintegration in this way. How you begin to turn the tide against that is unfortunately a long-term, serious and slow process. But Iraq doesn't have the luxury of time. It's faced with this very critical threat right now from ISIS, which is pushing through the country in quite a staggering fashion.
And Mina, so clearly he has a long battle ahead of him. He's already said that his first mission, if you like, as Prime Minister is to take on the IS, the Islamic State group problem, which is operating particularly in the north of the country. But in order to do that, as Shiraz alluded to, he's got to bring in the Sunnis, the disaffected Sunnis, and in so doing, he might be able to take the sting out of the rebellion taking place in the north of the country, because it's not just foreign fighters, is it?
It's not just foreign fighters, and Iraq has security problems that also expand into different armed groups. Whether they are militants of one sector or the other is really secondary. The problem is the state does not have a monopoly on arms in Iraq. In addition to that, while forming this government, and he has 4 weeks to do that, he has to find the right characters with the right experience to take on the positions of Minister of Interior and Minister of Defense, something that the previous government failed in. From 2010, Iraq did not have a Minister of Interior, and the Minister of Defense was vacant, and the Minister of Culture was acting Minister of Defense. So he needs to tackle the immediate problem of the militants on the ground, and you see now you have American military support, to some extent French military support going to the Peshmerga, which at the end of the day answers to the regional government. You're going to have to see how the Iraqi army can be fit to fight this threat, and on the other hand, politically, find the right people to fill in those crucial positions.
Mina, thank you for that. Mark, Mina's already mentioned the Peshmerga, of course, the fighting force aligned to the Kurdish regional government in the north of the country. We know that it was a Kurdish president who actually nominated Mr. Abadi. Do we know how the Kurds feel more generally then about the political process if this is successful and Mr. Abadi gets a government off the ground?
Well, in my view, in the last week and a half, since ISIS and the Islamic State have started attacking up north, the desire of the Kurds to strike out on their own, I think, has been somewhat attenuated. If there is anything that has come out of the recent combat up in the north, it's a realization by the Kurds that perhaps right now they still need Baghdad more than they thought they did about 2 weeks ago. So I'm always one to try to see the bright side of a particular situation, and it is hard to find that with what's happening up in the north. but to ensure that the Kurds don't decide to strike out on their own, declare total independence, and seek independent nationalism, ISIS has sort of demonstrated to them at this point that they're not ready for that.
Interesting. Well, at this point, it's worth pointing out that Mr. Abadi won't actually take over as Iraq's new Prime Minister straight away. And that, of course, leaves the spectre of continued political crisis, because under the Iraqi constitution, Abadi has 30 days in which to form a new government. Until then, Nouri al-Maliki remains the leader, the caretaker Prime Minister, and Commander-in-Chief, perhaps critically. And as yet, he hasn't shown any sign that he's willing to leave office. And on Wednesday, he said it would take a federal court ruling to force him from power. So where does this leave us right now? Is this a very dangerous moment? Mina, can I ask you first? Is this a very dangerous moment? Some people are predicting that this could be a moment of political explosion.
Absolutely. It's very dangerous on the political, but also on the military level, because as you rightly pointed out, he is the commander-in-chief. He was also running a military unit, so to speak, that was to secure Baghdad, the capital. So if he actually wanted to be entrenched in the capital, he may have those units that would support him. Of course, nobody really knows what's going on inside the military and if they would be willing to go that far. There was a militia, Asa'ib Ahl al-Haq, that were aligned with Maliki. However, in the last day, they have said that they actually won't support him and that they fall in line with the rest of the majority of the Islamist Shia parties, because they get their cue from Iran, and Iran's already made it clear that they don't support Maliki in this bid. It is worrying politically if Haider al-Abadi fails to form the government, so if there aren't the right deals cut, then the president must choose a different prime minister designate. And the crisis will continue if that happens. So it's by all means not over yet.
And Mark, what do we make then of this legal process that has now been triggered? Because papers have been lodged at the federal court with Maliki challenging the constitutionality of what's gone on. So is there much faith then in the judicial system, and how might this all play out?
Well, I think Mina's got it exactly right. Maliki has three cards in his deck. He can, one, try to take it to court and, in fact, try to get the appointing of Abadi as overruled by the court. That's yet to be seen. The judiciary has been seen in the past to be generally constitutionally bound, but every once in a while they'll slip through a decision that's not that doesn't make sense. His second card that he has is to try to interfere with the government formation process. Al-Abadi will need 165 votes, and even though there are a significant number of people falling away from the Maliki support, Maliki still does remain enough of a presence here that he could throw a wrench into the government formation process. The third card that he has, which I believe to be highly unlikely, is that having lost in the courts, having lost in the votes, that he depends on loyal military units. I believe that that's a bit of a stretch. There are some military leaders that obviously will have some problems in a non-Maliki administration, but I would be surprised if there was any large-scale military violence trying to uphold Maliki staying in power if it is clear that he is constitutionally replaced by a legitimate leader.
Shiraz, it's not going to help Mr. Abadi, is it, having a discontented and grumbling Maliki on the sidelines whilst he tries to get this Herculean task underway?
No, and I think this is part of the problem here, that we're seeing essentially Iraq's political leadership yet again fiddling while Rome burns. Iraq is facing a serious crisis, and now is not the time to be raising these kinds of really self-interested political positions in order to entrench himself further. The only other comment I would make here in relation to what the two other guests have said is it might be interesting to see to what extent international leverage and pressure is brought upon Maliki to try and force him out in order to try and transition here in a more stable and calm fashion. And it's not clear right now, but I think the Iranian involvement is significant, and the fact that they've given their backing here to a change, I think that might just help ease this process a little more than it would have otherwise.
All right, let's turn our attention a little bit more closely then to the situation in the north. We've already mentioned the fact that this is the part of the country that is currently experiencing the most activity, if you like, from IS fighters and their Sunni rebel allies. He's already identified that this will be the first thing that he has to battle with, I mean, quite literally, once he gets the Prime Minister's job. What does he need to do militarily, bearing in mind the Iraqi army virtually melted away when these fighters crossed over from Syria in the first instance?
What happened on the 10th of June when basically ISIS took over Mosul was that the Iraqi army didn't fight. What's unclear is whether they were given orders to fight and didn't, or whether they weren't given orders to fight, which is actually the story that's coming out more out of Iraq. So what Haider al-Abadi will have to do is actually get the Iraqi army back into action to actually fight through and face ISIS. We haven't actually seen any direct combat to try to push away the fighters inside of Mosul and around Mosul. And I would also say that what we've seen in the last few weeks is actually there aren't that many Iraqi rebels joining ranks with ISIS as we first expected in the first couple of weeks. It seems very much that ISIS has alienated some of those Sunni leaders, and therefore Haider al-Abadi will need to also reach out to them and include them in this process.
Mark, coming to you, Chuck Hagel has announced an extra 130 or so US personnel to go to the north, to Erbil, to, and I quote, have a look, take a closer look and see how the US can help Iraqis. What exactly does that mean? What sort of mission is this 130-strong mission going to Erbil? What exactly are they there to do?
Well, to use an old military expression, they are seen to be a directed telescope for the Secretary of Defense and for the CENTCOM commander to find out what is needed. We've already seen the first phase, which is humanitarian relief through air flights and some airstrikes being conducted, but that certainly is not enough. Both on the northern side, the northern flank of the ISIS operation against the Kurds, and the southern flank against the Iraqi security forces, there are serious gaps in the capability of the Iraqi security forces and the Peshmerga that the international community in general and the U.S. in particular can help. It's got to be more than just dropping bombs from 30,000 feet. There's got to be a serious look at their ground capabilities, support for their ground capabilities, more ammunition, more intelligence support, more aviation support, but not necessarily dropping bombs. And frankly, this has got to be done in exchange for a willingness on part of the Peshmerga and the Iraqi security forces to take the fight to the enemy. The Americans are not prepared, and the international community is not prepared to do this for the Iraqis. At the end of the day, it's got to be the Iraqi Jundi, it's got to be the Peshmerga fighter that picks up his rifle and attacks a force by many scales smaller than the Iraqi capabilities on the ground.
Okay, sorry, Mark, could I interrupt you, because
not enough.
Time is unfortunately running out on us. And Shiraz, I just wanted to put a point to you and ask you your reflections on what is motivating US intervention, the first time that they have rallied militarily in Iraq since 2011 when they pulled their troops out. What do you think is behind the US intervention?
Well, I think there's a number of factors at play here which influence Obama's decision to have gone in. The first and foremost, of course, is that the United States has a recent yet long history in Iraq, and there's a sense of ownership about what is transpiring. And whilst the United States certainly won't be committing ground troops again, I think looking at what could be a huge humanitarian catastrophe that is beginning to unfold right now, there was a sense of an ability to go into a very clearly defined mission to go and relieve this tension, and support from the government of Iraq
Shiraz,
itself calling on the United States
I'm
to come
so
in.
sorry. I'm going to have to butt in there and end the conversation. Unfortunately, we could talk forever, couldn't we? But Shiraz Maher at King's College in London, thank you very much. Mark Kimmitt, talking to us live from Baghdad. Thank you very much indeed for your contribution. And of course, Mina Al Oraibi, also from London. Thank you very much for talking to us here on Inside Story. And thank you, of course, for watching. You remember, you can always add your voice to this discussion. You can leave your comments on facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. There's always Twitter @AJ Inside Story. I'm Martine Dennis. Thank you for watching. Bye for now.